Welcome to the wildest side of history you were never taught. Hey there, curious minds and fellow night owls. Buckle up because tonight we're peeling back the velvet curtain on one of the most bizarre, scandalous, and surprisingly hilarious chapters of human history. This isn't T or high school textbook S version of the Middle Ages. No gray timelines, no dusty scrolls, no knights in shining armor politely courting maidens in moonlit gardens. No. This is the real Middle Ages, where privacy was a fantasy, romance was a transaction, and foreplay meant whispering sweet nothings while your in-laws and a goat shared the room. Yeah, welcome to medieval sex. And before you think, oh, it can't be that weird, let me stop you right there. We're talking about a world where brothels paid taxes, where priests grilled couples about their bedroom activities in excruciating detail, and where entire lists of forbidden sex days were carefully compiled by men in robes who really should be minded their own business. This was a time when chastity belts were a punchline, romance was dictated by lunar calendars, and if you wanted to be affectionate on a Wednesday, you better check with your priest first. Forget what you've seen in Hollywood dramas or fantasy novels. Real medieval intimacy was confusing, deeply regulated, and often downright uncomfortable, literally and figuratively. But it was also human, tender, rebellious, and sometimes kind of funny. So before we dive headfirst into this candlelit chaos, do me a favor. Hit that like button if you enjoy the mix of weird history and wicked storytelling. Subscribe if you're the kind of person who likes your history with a side of spice. And drop a comment below telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now, because there's nothing quite like discussing medieval bedroom politics with strangers around the world at 2 a.m. Now, light a candle, or don't, no judgment. Get comfortable. Maybe grab a snack, and keep your headphones in. Trust me, you do not want to explain this episode to your grandma, because we're about to time travel into a world where love was calculated, passion was policed, and even holding hands could spark a village scandal. Ready? Let's begin. Privacy. Not even close. Let us kick things off by smashing one of the most persistent myths about medieval intimacy. The fantasy of silk sheets, flickering candlelight, and a lute playing softly in the background. Sounds romantic, right? Now forget all of it. In truth, for the vast majority of people, intimacy didn't happen in private. It happened in proximity. Most peasants lived in one-room homes. Not one bedroom. One room. That meant your living room, kitchen, bedroom, pantry, barn, and sometimes even bathroom were all the same space. It wasn't uncommon to share your romantic night with a few sleeping children, aging parents, maybe a couple of goats, and a chicken with boundary issues. Privacy, as we understand it today, just didn't exist. Curtains were a luxury. Walls were rare. Doors might not lock or even close properly. So if a couple wanted a moment of closeness, they had to master the ancient art of subtlety. Volume control was essential. Timing was crucial. And ideally, the kids were asleep, facing the wall, and already snoring. Beds weren't much better. They were shared, not just by couples, but sometimes by the whole household. In wealthier homes, a servant might sleep at the foot of the bed, not in another room, not down the hall, literally at the foot, pretending very hard to be asleep. Because pretending not to notice was basically a survival skill. Even in noble households, where you'd expect a bit more separation, servants were always nearby, in part for convenience, but also because having people around you 24/7 was the status symbol of the time. Nothing said important like never being alone. And then there was travel. Want a romantic getaway? Good luck. Inns were often overcrowded and beds were scarce. You didn't get your own room. You got half a mattress, shared with a complete stranger who might still be wearing their boots. Want to be intimate while on the road? You'd better double-check who's in the bed, what time it is, and whether your roommate is actually asleep, or just facing the wall out of courtesy. And let's not forget the gossip. In small medieval communities, sound traveled faster than morals. The houses were made of wood, the walls were thin, and the local busybodies had ears like hunting dogs. If someone so much as whispered something vaguely romantic, it could become tomorrow's sermon illustration. Or worse, the inspiration for a passive-aggressive market stall conversation. It wasn't just the peasants, either. Even the upper class, with their slightly thicker walls and fancier bedding, weren't immune to scrutiny. Noble families often kept written records of bedroom arrangements for legal or religious reasons, meaning someone, somewhere, was officially documenting who slept where, with whom, and on what days. A bureaucratic nightmare with serious HR department meets the confessional booth energy. So, was there intimacy in the Middle Ages? Absolutely. But it wasn't sexy in the modern sense. It was strategic, opportunistic, often clumsy. It happened in the shadows, behind hastily pulled blankets, and under the constant pressure of being extremely quiet. Because in a world where alone time didn't exist, love had to be sneaky. And chickens were always watching. Let us get one thing straight from the beginning. Whatever image you have in your head of medieval romance, it's probably wrong. Candlelit bedrooms, silk sheets, a lute gently strumming in the corner while lovers whisper poetry? Toss it, burn it, forget it ever existed. That fantasy belongs in a modern TV drama, not in a world where hygiene was optional. Windows were made of animal skin, and your closest confidant might be a goat. In reality, intimacy in the Middle Ages happened under conditions we'd barely consider acceptable for storing potatoes, let alone for kindling romance. Most peasants, and they made up the overwhelming majority of the population, lived in homes that can only be described as open concept, if we're being generous. We're talking about a single-room dwelling, often no bigger than a small modern studio apartment, and shared by an entire family, plus the occasional extended relative, baby livestock, and, yes, chickens that had absolutely zero respect for privacy. The same straw mattress where you and your spouse might attempt a little closeness after a hard day's work was likely shared with your toddler, your grandmother, or a visiting cousin passing through. And that's assuming you even had a mattress. Many peasants made do with hay on the floor or a wooden plank softened by old blankets. Comfort wasn't the goal. Survival was. Curtains, a luxury. Doors, questionable. Walls that actually divided space? What are those? In the typical medieval household, your bedroom, kitchen, workshop, and animal pen were all squished into one open space. You might find a fire pit in the center for cooking. And no chimney, by the way. So your home was often filled with smoke thick enough to season your clothes. That smoky atmosphere did little for the mood, and everything for respiratory infections. Let's say you're a married couple trying to find a quiet moment. You had to be strategic. You'd wait until the kids were asleep, or at least pretending to be. You'd lower your voices, time everything carefully, and hope the family goat wasn't having one of its insomniac nights. Forget music and mood lighting. Your soundtrack was snoring, wheezing, and maybe the unsettling crunch of a rodent in the corner. Even the wealthy weren't spared. Sure, noble families had more space and better materials, but they were never alone. Servants were part of the furniture. Literally. Some slept on mats at the foot of the bed, ready to respond if the Lord needed wine, a blanket, or a scapegoat. And if you were hoping the help would discreetly look away during your private moments, think again. They were trained to pretend like nothing was happening, while hearing everything. This wasn't just about physical space, it was about surveillance culture. Medieval society wasn't shy about policing personal behavior, and that included what went on under the blankets. Gossip was a serious currency. In small villages, news spread faster than the Black Death. If a neighbor overheard even the slightest whisper of intimacy, especially outside of marriage, you could expect a reputation hit, followed by sermons, shame, or some aggressively raised eyebrows at the market. And don't think travel made things easier. Inns were rough, packed, and often operated like medieval sleepover camps for adults. Beds were shared by total strangers. You could end up spooning with someone who smelled like fermented onions and had tea taken off their boots in 3 days. And yes, that's a documented complaint from several period sources. If you were traveling with your spouse and wanted a little affection, you'd better double-check who else was in the bed and whether they were asleep, awake, or just quietly judging you under their cloak. Even within marriage, intimacy wasn't always private or spontaneous. Nobility had to keep meticulous records of who was sleeping where and when. These weren't love journals. They were legal documents, often overseen by priests or advisors, especially when the goal was to prove heirs were born of legitimate unions. Think of it like an extremely awkward audit of your love life, overseen by your family lawyer and your local bishop. Meanwhile, religious institutions took things even further. In monasteries and convents, privacy was outlawed. Doors didn't lock. Beds were simple, narrow, and spaced in full view of everyone else. The idea was to eliminate all temptation, but human nature, as it turns out, has a great sense of humor. Many abbeys built incredibly high garden walls not for spiritual symbolism, but to keep outsiders from sneaking in, or insiders from sneaking out. Let that sink in. And then there was the architecture. In castles, stone walls did little to muffle sound. Echoes carried and doors creaked loud enough to wake the dead, or at least the grumpy steward sleeping down the hall. Tapestries weren't just decorative. They were often the only thing standing between your marital duties and the cold, judgmental stare of a coat of arms. The lack of privacy wasn't just inconvenient, it shaped behavior. Couples had to be discreet, quiet, and adaptive. Every intimate moment was a balancing act between desire, decency, and logistics. If modern couples argue over who left the toothpaste cap off, medieval couples probably argued over whether the cow was tied up far enough from the house to not interrupt the mood. Even literature from the period reflects this chaotic intimacy. Love poems and ballads are filled with metaphors, hidden gardens, stolen glances, secret rendezvous. Not because writers were being poetic, but because real privacy was so rare, it practically required magic. So yes, there was intimacy in the Middle Ages, but it wasn't pretty, it wasn't romantic, and it certainly wasn't quiet. It was awkward, improvised, and constantly under the watchful eye of neighbors, livestock, and the ever-present judgment of the church. And somehow, through all of that, the population still grew. If you think modern society has strong opinions about your love life, just wait until you meet the medieval church. For over 1,000 years, it was the ultimate third wheel in every marriage, peering into bedrooms, whispering into confessionals, and generally making sure that whatever fun you thought you were having was either spiritually dangerous or calendrically forbidden. Let's be clear. The church in medieval Europe wasn't just about Sunday Mass and the occasional hymn. It was the moral authority, the legal system, and the neighborhood watch all rolled into one. And it had a lot to say about what happened beneath the sheets, or more accurately, beneath the shared hay pile beside the fire pit, while your great aunt and 2 chickens tried to sleep 5 feet away. The official stance was simple and grim. Intimacy was for procreation. Not pleasure, not bonding, not stress relief, definitely not experimentation. Just babies. Ideally, 1 baby per act. No laughter, no eye contact, and absolutely no smiling afterward. According to church teachings, anything that didn't directly result in the possibility of conception was considered at best a distraction, and at worst, a mortal sin. This wasn't a casual opinion. It was formal doctrine, enforced by bishops, theologians, and confessors, who, we should note, were often celibate men with absolutely no practical experience and far too much time to write about the dangers of lust. These weren't vague guidelines. There were rules, down to the day, the position, the motivation, and sometimes even the facial expression. Think of it as the original terms and conditions, but for touching your spouse. Let's start with the calendar, which quickly became less of a helpful tool and more of a theological booby trap. Certain days were off limits. many days. In fact, nearly half the year was considered unsuitable for intimacy. Sundays? Off limits. It was a Lord's Day. Fridays? No, that was a day of penance, which, ironically, some couples probably needed after trying to keep track of all these rules. Wednesdays? Suspicious. Feast days? Forbidden. Fasting days? Absolutely not. And then there were entire seasons. Lent, for example. 40 days of spiritual reflection, repentance, and absolutely no physical affection. Advent? Another 40 days. Certain saints' feast days? Better not. Moon phases. Sometimes even those were suspect. If you were trying to plan a romantic evening in the 13th century, you basically needed a liturgical calendar, a priest's approval, and the patience of a saint. Even within marriage, the guidelines were stifling. Couples were expected to approach one another with restraint, modesty, and ideally, a complete lack of enjoyment. Expressions of affection were technically allowed, but enthusiasm was not. Passion was considered suspect. One 13th century manual, written for married Christians, mind you, advised that intimacy should be conducted without pleasure, without sin, and without delay. That's right. The goal was nikaiti, to enjoy your spouse's company. It was to finish as quickly as possible, then go confess about it. As for positions, missionary was the only one the church fully approved of, not because it was particularly romantic, but because it was considered the natural order, with man above and woman below, as God and gravity intended. Anything else, sideways from behind, standing up, or, heaven forbid, with laughter, was considered unnatural, disordered, or straight-up heretical. And let's not forget the confession. Medieval confession wasn't a vague chat about your feelings. Priests often asked specific, even uncomfortably graphic questions. Some confession manuals went into such detail that it's a wonder the confessors didn't require emotional hazard pay. They wanted to know not just what you did, but how, when, why, and whether you enjoyed it. Many friars in the 14th century knew more about their parishioners' sex lives than their actual names. But was enforcement consistent? Not exactly. The church's teachings were strict, yes, but how seriously they were enforced varied wildly by region, class, and how nosy your local priest was. In some rural areas, people nodded politely at the priest's warnings, then did whatever they were going to do anyway, quietly and preferably facing away from any religious iconography. Peasants had more pressing concerns, surviving the winter, feeding their animals, avoiding plague. If a bit of passion happened on a forbidden Tuesday, well, you just confess it later and get on with your life. The upper classes, however, were under a bit more scrutiny. Nobles had spiritual advisors, chaplains, and confessors practically living in their homes, watching, judging, and occasionally keeping bedroom logs for posterity. That's not a joke. Noble households sometimes recorded who slept where and with whom, as part of legal inheritance rights or church obligations. So, if your ancestors had questionable timing, there might literally be a dusty Latin record of it in a monastery somewhere. The church's influence went beyond private life. It even shaped public reputation. Couples known to be too affectionate could be publicly shamed. One 13th century bishop scolded a married couple for being intimate more than once a month and advised them to redirect their urges toward prayer, which, incidentally, is one of the coldest medieval burns on record. Now, let's talk about the spiritual consequences. According to many theologians, engaging in intimacy at the wrong time, say during Lent, could result in more than just spiritual guilt. Some believed it could lead to physical consequences: sickly children, divine punishment, crop failures, or, worst of all, a reputation. And once the village found out you'd been celebrating too enthusiastically during Advent, you could expect gossip, social shunning, or a very intense sermon delivered with maximum eye contact. It wasn't just about personal purity. These rules were tied to cosmic order. The soul was supposed to focus on heaven. The body, a necessary inconvenience, one that had to be controlled, contained, and preferably ignored. So much so that many medieval theologians debated whether intimacy could ever be done without sin, even in marriage. St. Jerome famously claimed that even within holy matrimony, a man who is too fond of his wife is an adulterer at heart. Romantic. So what did all this mean in practice? It meant that for most medieval Christians, intimacy was something carried out quietly, carefully, and often with a ticking clock of guilt in the background. It meant planning around holy days, confessing afterward, and hoping that your confessor was having a merciful day. And it meant living in a world where the most important people in your spiritual life also wanted to know way too much about your physical one. Yet, despite all the rules, warnings, and theological roadblocks, people still found ways to love, connect, and, yes, occasionally break the rules. Because while the church might have preached restraint, the human heart has always been a little harder to discipline. If modern dating feels complicated, spare a thought for medieval romantics, those brave souls navigating a world where courtship was less Netflix and chill and more who owns the largest pig and how many sacks of grain come with the bride. In the Middle Ages, falling in love was a risky and often irrelevant business. For most people, especially in the peasant class, romance came after marriage, if at all. The courtship process wasn't about sparks flying or butterflies in your stomach. It was about land, livestock, alliances, and the all-important goal of not starting a blood feud over someone's goat eating the neighbor's cabbage. Let's start with the basics. Marriage wasn't about love. It was a contract, a business transaction, and a tool for diplomacy. Even among those who couldn't read or write, families arranged matches to consolidate power, settle disputes, or ensure their daughter didn't end up living in the barn with a goat named Jeffrey. The idea of marrying for affection, that was charming and dangerously naive. Among the nobility, courtship was a political chess match, orchestrated by parents, guardians, or even kings. These marriages weren't just about two people. They were about land rights, military alliances, and whether your family could lay claim to the next plot over. A single noble marriage could change the fate of a region. So if you were a medieval noblewoman dreaming of romance, you were more likely to get a scroll listing your future husband as assets than a love poem. And the negotiations were often long and brutally honest. Families would haggle over dowries like they were buying a particularly moody cow. A daughter might come with a bundle of linens, a silver goblet, and a bit of land with dubious drainage. In return, the groom's family promised livestock, protection, and, if everyone played nice, a wedding feast that didn't end in a duel. Courtship, when it happened at all, was highly supervised. Forget candlelit dinners or whispered secrets. In many cases, young people were never allowed to be alone together. A maiden might be chaperoned by her mother, a stern aunt, or, if her reputation was particularly delicate, an entire household that watched her like unpaid bouncers at the Church of Purity. Even peasants, who had a little more flexibility, weren't exactly free to follow their hearts. Their courtships were public affairs, often conducted under the curious gaze of neighbors, livestock, and the village gossip mill. Holding hands might get you noticed. Kissing could get you fined. And anything more scandalous might earn you a mandatory church penance or a highly disappointed father sharpening his pitchfork in the yard. In some villages, there were set rituals for courtship. One custom involved a suitor visiting a young woman's home, and being allowed, with permission, to sit on her bed while she spun wool or pretended not to be mortified. They might talk quietly, exchange compliments, and occasionally, if the family approves, hold hands under the strict supervision of a grandmother who'd seen too much. But even with all the rules, humans are humans. Secret flirtations were a part of life. Love songs, sly glances, accidental meetings at the village well. These were the side quests of medieval romance. The bold might pass notes or carve initials into tree trunks. The truly daring might try to sneak a kiss behind the barn, risking both public humiliation and hay-related rashes. Among the nobility, things got even stranger. Since most aristocratic marriages were arranged at young ages, sometimes when the bride and groom were literal children, the actual courtship, if it ever happened, was symbolic at best. A young lord might send a gift, a ring, a jewel, or a particularly well-fed falcon. In return, the lady might offer a token, a handkerchief, a lock of hair, or a nod of vague indifference. There was also a booming tradition of courtly love, which was as dramatic as it sounds. This was the poetic fantasy of noble knights falling hopelessly in love with noble ladies, often already married, and writing endless verses about their aching hearts, noble suffering, and yearning glances from across the feast table. Courtly love rarely led to marriage. It was more like an emotional role play with a strict no-touching policy. Think of it as medieval fan fiction with real political stakes. The phrase love match did exist, but it was the exception, not the rule. In fact, marrying purely for love could be seen as suspicious, impulsive, or even rebellious. That kind of emotional recklessness belonged in troubadour ballads, not in respectable households. A practical marriage, one based on shared land, good tools, and decent fertility prospects, that was something people could toast to. And yet, love still happened. Sometimes, against the odds, couples who married for duty grew to care for each other. Shared hardship, daily survival, and the long, quiet evenings after the children finally fell asleep could breed a kind of affection deeper than fireworks or serenades. Love grew slowly, like moss on a castle wall, patient, steady, and oddly romantic in its own earthy way. For the unlucky, however, marriage could be a lifelong sentence. Divorce wasn't an option unless you were royalty and had the Pope on speed dial. For everyone else, you were in it for the long haul, regardless of affection, compatibility, or how often your spouse chewed with their mouth open. Separation was allowed only under extreme circumstances, and even then, remarriage was usually off the table. The Church took marriage very seriously. It was a sacrament, a holy bond meant to mirror the relationship between Christ and the Church. Breaking that bond wasn't just legally difficult, it was spiritually dangerous. So couples were encouraged to stick it out, no matter how much they hated each other's faces by the third Lent. And let's talk about consent, because that's a tricky topic in medieval law. Technically, the Church taught that both parties had to consent to a marriage. A wedding was invalid without free will, a surprisingly progressive stance for the time. But in practice, consent could be pressured, manipulated, or outright assumed by the families involved. A nervous yes in front of witnesses could lock you into a lifetime of shared chores and theological guilt. Still, even in this rigid world, love found a way. Peasants carved hearts into trees. Noblewomen exchanged glances at feasts. Farmhands sang ballads to the girl who helped with the cider pressing. Secret weddings, forbidden liaisons, and passionate letters written by candlelight all flourished under the surface of arranged unions and parental expectations. Because no matter how many rules the Church wrote, how many documents the lawyers drew up, or how many angry fathers stood with crossed arms, people kept falling in love. And in that way, the Middle Ages weren't so different after all. Let's begin with a mental image. One you've probably seen in cartoons, museum displays, or highly questionable novelty shops. A medieval woman, locked in a cold iron contraption, grimacing in discomfort while her husband rides off to war with the only key dangling from his belt. That, dear viewer, is the chastity belt, one of the most enduring and most hilariously misunderstood myths of the Middle Ages. Except, here's the twist. It's almost certainly not real. That's right. The chastity belt, despite its fame in pop culture and high school history jokes, is largely a product of Renaissance imagination, Victorian prudery, and 19th century museum curators with a flair for drama. There is no credible evidence these devices were widely used, or even seriously intended, during the medieval period. But before we dismantle the myth, let's talk about the legend itself. The classic story goes like this. When knights left for the Crusades, they locked up their wives, and sometimes daughters, in iron underwear to ensure fidelity while they were off fighting for God and glory. These belts were supposedly forged from metal, lined with spikes, and secured with a padlock, making them equal parts protection, punishment, and personal plumbing nightmare. It's a great story, especially if you're a Victorian moralist with a passion for repressed sexuality and a dark sense of humor. But it's also spectacularly unsupported by actual medieval sources. For one thing, let's talk logistics. A woman wearing a tight-fitting, non-removable metal device for days, let alone weeks or months, would be at severe risk for infection, injury, and full-blown sepsis. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was already a gamble. Add in a locked metal plate with no ventilation, and you're not preventing sin. You're inventing urinary tract infections before antibiotics existed. And if you're thinking, well, maybe they had ways to clean it, ask yourself how. Most depictions of chastity belts don't even have functioning hinges, let alone practical sanitation features. A woman would have needed a blacksmith, a miracle, or a very awkward bath routine just to get through the week. Moreover, contemporary medieval records are suspiciously silent on the matter. And we mean really silent. Medieval people wrote about everything, including incredibly awkward and intimate details of their private lives. Manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries discuss sins and confession, marital disputes, sexual positions, usually frowned upon, and even the best days for reproduction. If chastity belts were real and widespread, we'd expect at least one angry bishop or one nosy scribe to comment on them. Instead, the first real mention of chastity belts comes centuries later, during the Renaissance in the 15th and 16th centuries, and even then, the references are more jokes or allegories than factual accounts. By the time the 18th and 19th centuries rolled around, museum collectors, fascinated by all things medieval and morally scandalous, began displaying chastity belts, most of which were either fakes or Renaissance-era satire pieces never meant for actual use. In fact, many of these so-called medieval chastity belts were later proven to be Victorian forgeries, designed to titillate or terrify audiences who believed the Middle Ages were one long, joyless slog of piety, plague, and perverse control. The irony: the people who invented or revived the chastity belt myth were often more sexually repressed than the medieval people they were mocking. So, if chastity belts weren't real, how was fidelity enforced? Great question. The answer: social pressure, surveillance, and a good dose of religious guilt. Among the nobility, women were rarely left alone. Young maidens were guarded more tightly than castle gates. Married noblewomen often had chaperones, attendants, or literal guards shadowing them around the estate. Privacy? Not a thing. Servants, confessors, and concerned aunts were always nearby, just waiting to sound the moral alarm. In peasant communities, things were no easier. Villages were small, close-knit, and extremely nosy. If you so much as held hands behind the granary, 5 people saw it. 2 of them were already telling the priest, and 1 was carving your initials into a sinners to watch list in their mental notebook. Reputation was currency, and a rumor could cost you a dowry, a marriage proposal, or your place in the church pew. And then, of course, there was the church, always ready with a sermon about purity, virtue, and the spiritual consequences of even thinking about someone's ankles for too long. Premarital or extramarital sex wasn't just risky, it was sinful. A stain not just on your soul, but on your family name, your potential to marry, and possibly your future afterlife. Instead of locking women in metal cages, societies relied on what we might call behavioral chastity belts: shame, fear, honor, and highly motivated relatives. Now, that's not to say no one ever cheated. They absolutely did. Adultery existed, affairs happened, and lovers met in secret, sometimes even in monasteries. But getting caught could mean public penance, divorce, if you were noble and lucky, loss of inheritance, or being paraded around town in your underwear holding a sign that said, "I got caught behind the mill." Not exactly romantic. And what about the men? Here's where things get even more lopsided. While female chastity was obsessively policed, male infidelity was often treated with a shrug, a smirk, or at worst, a sermon. Noblemen kept mistresses openly. Kings had entire favorite courts. Priests were supposed to be celibate. Many weren't. Double standards much? This hypocrisy is one reason why brothels were tolerated, and sometimes regulated, by medieval towns. Better, the reasoning went, for lustful men to visit a tax-paying sex worker in a designated area than to mess with someone's daughter and start a blood feud. Towns like Paris, London, and Florence had legal red-light districts as early as the 13th century, complete with health inspections and zoning laws. That's right, brothels had more municipal oversight than some castles. So where did the chastity belt myth come from? Most likely it was born out of Renaissance moral anxiety, where people obsessed over controlling desire, punishing lust, and mocking the barbaric past they were trying to leave behind. The image of a woman locked in iron was both a symbol and a satire, a visual joke about jealous husbands, controlling patriarchy, and the fear of female sexuality. Later, in the Victorian era, chastity belts made a comeback, not as real devices but as museum curiosities and moral conversation starters. Many belts displayed in 19th century museums were labeled medieval, even though they'd been made the week before out of wrought iron, artistic license, and a total misunderstanding of plumbing. To this day, you can find chastity belts in some museums, often labeled more carefully now, with explanations about their likely satirical origins. But the damage was done. The myth had entered pop culture, and like most historical half-truths, it stuck. And honestly, that's kind of a shame, because the real story of medieval intimacy is far more complex, human, and fascinating than any metal underpants could ever be. It's a story of faith, fear, love, control, community, rebellion, and yes, a whole lot of whispered secrets and badly timed goat noises. So next time someone mentions chastity belts, feel free to smile knowingly and say, "Ah, yes, the ultimate example of historical fan fiction." Picture a medieval town square. Cobblestone streets, open-air markets, wandering livestock at the clang of a distant blacksmith, and nestled just a few alleys away an officially sanctioned brothel, possibly with a sign featuring St. Mary Magdalene and a municipal seal. That's not fiction. That's a historical fact. Contrary to the common image of the Middle Ages as an age of strict religious repression, many medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels. They licensed, taxed, and regulated them. In some cities, brothels were managed with all the bureaucratic seriousness of a bakery or blacksmith shop. Sex work, for a time, was considered a necessary and even stabilizing force in society. A controlled outlet for male desire, which was otherwise seen as volatile and potentially dangerous. To modern ears, this might sound wildly contradictory. The same church that preached purity and sinless living also quietly approved of public houses of prostitution. But welcome to the Middle Ages, where moral theory and practical governance were often on completely different scrolls. Let's take a look at some specifics. Licensed lust: how cities managed brothels. In many medieval urban centers, particularly in France, the Holy Roman Empire, and parts of Italy and England, brothels were legal, regulated businesses. Town councils issued licenses to brothel owners, usually men, who were required to follow a long list of rules that governed everything from pricing to hygiene to employee conduct. For example, in 15th century Nuremberg, brothel workers were subject to city health inspections. They had to register with local officials and undergo regular checks to prevent the spread of disease. Certain days of operation were restricted, usually religious feast days or Sundays, and owners could be fined for operating on the Lord's Day. Some brothels had dress codes. In Florence, sex workers were required to wear a yellow scarf or a specific belt, so they could be easily identified. In London's Southwark district, the infamous stews, a nickname for bathhouses turned brothels, operated under regulations that prohibited workers from soliciting in churches, forcing clients to stay, or overcharging. Yes, even medieval cities had consumer protection laws for sex. In Avignon, a city with strong papal ties, brothels were directly under church authority, managed, astonishingly, by religious administrators who rationalized it as a way to prevent greater evils like adultery, rape, or fornication with virgins. This was moral triage, better a regulated sin than an unpredictable scandal. The workers, between survival and stigma. The women who worked in these establishments occupied a precarious position, both essential and marginal, tolerated and yet publicly shamed. Many entered sex work due to poverty, abandonment, or being orphaned. In cities where marriage was expensive and dowries were hard to come by, sex work became one of the few avenues to financial independence, however limited. In larger brothels, the women were often not enslaved or imprisoned, contrary to later depictions. They were, by medieval standards, employees. Some even formed informal hierarchies or cooperatives. Older women might become madams or manage finances. A few saved enough to eventually leave the profession by marrying, buying property, or entering a convent, ironically one of the only socially acceptable escape routes. That said, the line between choice and coercion was never entirely clear. While many women worked voluntarily, others were trafficked, sometimes across regions, especially in port cities like Venice and Marseille, where foreign women were particularly vulnerable. Legal brothels didn't prevent exploitation, but they did create at least a framework of visibility and protection. Limited, yes, but better than the total invisibility of clandestine sex work. The church's oddly strategic blind eye. So, how did the church, the same institution that once banned dancing, condemned laughter, and warned against marital intimacy during Lent, justify this apparent contradiction? Enter St. Augustine, the 4th century theologian who famously wrote that prostitution, while sinful, was a necessary evil. He compared it to the sewer system in a city. Remove prostitutes from society, and you will unsettle everything with lust. His metaphor stuck, disturbingly well. Medieval theologians echoed this sentiment, arguing that regulated sin was preferable to unregulated chaos. A brothel, properly controlled, was a pressure valve, an outlet to keep men from committing worse sins like adultery, rape, or the even more dreaded specter of unnatural acts, a euphemism covering everything from masturbation to homosexuality. As long as the act was transactional, not affectionate, and didn't involve a married woman or the Sabbath, it was, unofficially, tolerable. Confessors might still demand penance from men who visited brothels, but the penalties were often light. Say 5 Hail Marys, one priest might recommend. Another might insist on a donation to the poor, which, given the church's own land holdings and revenues, could be interpreted as a kind of divine kickback system. Hypocrisy and hierarchy. Who could get away with what? As you might guess, the rules were rarely applied evenly. Noblemen could frequent brothels with little consequence. Kings were known to have entire favorite courts filled with mistresses, dancers, and women who were paid, sometimes lavishly, to keep the monarch entertained. Their behavior was whispered about, joked about, but rarely punished. After all, who was going to scold the king? Clergy was another matter. Though officially celibate, many priests had housekeepers who were, in practice, unofficial wives. Some even had children, nicknamed nephews, in one of history's most transparent euphemisms. Bishops occasionally cracked down, but many turned a blind eye unless a scandal broke into public view. Women, by contrast, paid the steepest price. A woman caught selling sex outside of a licensed brothel or worse, doing so without a male guardian or guild affiliation, could face public whipping, exile, or forced penance. In some cases, she might be made to wear a symbolic garment, like a sackcloth robe, or crawl through the streets on her knees as townspeople watched. The double standard was systemic, and that's no surprise. For most of the Middle Ages, a woman's value was measured by her sexual purity, while a man's virtue was judged by his honor, wealth, and battlefield record. Not necessarily in that order. Decline and demonization. When tolerance ran out. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the mood began to shift. As Europe moved into the Renaissance and Reformation, tolerance for brothels waned. Syphilis, which swept through Europe like wildfire in the 1490s, changed public opinion. Suddenly, sex work wasn't just morally suspect, it was medically dangerous. Cities began shutting down brothels in the name of health and virtue. The rise of Protestant reformers, many of whom condemned public vice with biblical fervor, also led to new crackdowns. Martin Luther, despite being more lenient about marriage and sex than many Catholic leaders, wasn't exactly brothel-friendly. As morality became a public battleground, sex workers once protected by city ordinances were cast out, imprisoned, or forced into penance. The era of municipal tolerance came to a close, not because people stopped paying for sex, but because society lost its willingness to admit it. If you've ever dreamed of falling in love under the stars, exchanging secret poems, or wooing your beloved with a lute solo beneath a tower window, congratulations. You've absorbed the ideals of medieval romance literature, not medieval reality. The real Middle Ages were far less Romeo and Juliet, and far more contract and livestock. Courtship in medieval Europe was, for most people, not a personal journey but a communal negotiation. It was a process shaped by class, faith, family honor, and property law. Love might bloom, eventually, but it was rarely the reason two people ended up together. The goal was not passion, but stability. Social, economic, and, ideally, reproductive. Still, that doesn't mean the medieval world was loveless. It just meant love had to find cracks in the system. And sometimes those cracks grew wide enough to let real affection slip through. Marriage, the ultimate business deal. Let's start with the basics. Marriage was a contract, a legally binding, spiritually sanctioned agreement between two families, not just two individuals. The union itself could be finalized with as little as two people saying, "I do." No priest, no witnesses, no paperwork required. But for it to be socially recognized, and especially if it involved property or inheritance, the community had to be involved. Among the nobility, marriage was an instrument of strategy. Kings, dukes, and knights arranged matches to consolidate land, secure alliances, and avoid feuds. A wedding could mean the end of a border dispute or the beginning of a new political faction. In this world, a daughter was not a cherished princess awaiting her prince, but a bargaining chip, ideally wrapped in silk and accompanied by a large dowry. Marriages were often arranged when the bride and groom were still children. Betrothals, formal promises of future marriage, could be made when a girl was as young as 7, with the actual wedding taking place once she reached puberty. Some noble girls were married off by 12 or 13, especially in Southern Europe. Consent was technically required by the church, but consent from a 14-year-old being married off to a 30-year-old landholder was flexible at best. Men had slightly more leeway, but were still expected to marry in line with family plans. Love matches, those rare unions based on genuine affection, were seen as either naive or dangerous, depending on who was involved. In fact, marrying without your lord's permission could be considered a punishable offense. And yes, that applied even to serfs. Peasant courtship. More sweat, less poetry. Among peasants, things were more informal, but no less practical. Most people lived in tight-knit rural communities where everyone knew everyone else's family, debts, oxen, and drinking habits. Courtship involved public signals, attending the same dances, working nearby at harvest, sitting together at church, rather than private gestures. A young man's eligibility might depend on whether he owned land, had a decent plow, or was free from outstanding fines. For women, status came from reputation. Was she hardworking, modest, and fertile-looking? Could she weave, milk, cook, and avoid scandal? If so, she was a catch. Many matches were overseen by family elders, village councils, or even local priests who doubled as informal matchmakers. Dowries were still expected, though they might consist of linens, livestock, tools, or even a goat rather than gold coins. In some areas, a bride's family might provide a pig and a blanket, and the groom's family might counter with a bushel of wheat and a new roof tile. Romance. This isn't to say affection didn't exist. In fact, the lower you went on the social ladder, the more likely it was that people chose their own partners, especially if they could do so quietly. But even then, social pressures loomed large. Getting caught, walking out, with the wrong person, i.e., someone with bad reputation, different religion, or worse, from the next village over, could bring shame or worse, a ruined marriage negotiation with someone more appropriate. Chaperones, courtly codes, and crushing it from afar. Romance among the noble classes followed very different rules and very different risks. Unmarried noblewomen were often closely supervised, their behavior regulated by entire households of guards, servants, and elderly aunts who knew all the tricks. A noble girl might be watched during dances, escorted during walks, and even sleep in a chamber with other maidens, lest temptation wander in through the window. Enter courtly love, the literary tradition that filled medieval romances with tales of knights pining for unattainable ladies, composing songs by moonlight, or dying of heartbreak beside a castle wall. It was poetic, exaggerated, and, crucially, not meant to reflect real marriage. In fact, many of these stories explicitly involved adulterous love. Noblewomen married to political husbands, falling for handsome squires or charming poets. This wasn't an accident. Courtly love was less about real-life expectations and more about emotional fantasy. In a world where love and marriage rarely went hand in hand, this genre allowed readers, especially women, to imagine what it might feel like to be desired, pursued, or even understood. It was a safe space, one that ended when the book closed and duty resumed. But some people blurred the line. Secret notes, hidden gifts, and dangerous rendezvous happened, and sometimes they led to scandal, duels, or exile. Love was a risky business. Secret marriages and public consequences. For those bold enough to choose love over duty, the consequences could be severe. Because, as it turns out, the church might recognize a secret marriage, but the community might not, and that meant inheritance, legitimacy, and social status could all be thrown into chaos. There are documented cases of young couples eloping, swearing vows in secret under a tree or beside a stream. According to canon law, if two people freely consented and consummated the union, it was technically valid, even if no one else knew. But good luck convincing your angry parents, local lord, or bishop. Some communities retaliated by declaring the marriage invalid, cutting off inheritance, or forcing the couple to undergo public penance. Others simply exiled the couple or refused to baptize their children. Love might be recognized by God, but society had other rules. Love after marriage, a rare but real reward. While love before marriage was rare, love after marriage was possible, and occasionally celebrated. Chronicles mention couples who grew to respect and admire each other, who raised children together, worked the land side by side, or prayed as partners in faith. Some tomb inscriptions even refer to spouses as beloved companion or faithful friend, suggesting affection that grew over time. These were not the star-crossed lovers of ballads, but slow-burning relationships, born from shared hardship, mutual duty, and maybe, if you were lucky, a bit of affection between the prayers, plowing, and plague. You might think that cloistered life in a medieval monastery or convent was the perfect antidote to temptation. All silence, scripture, and scheduled prayer. No distractions, no drama. just a quiet cell, a humble meal, and the rhythmic toll of the church bell marking the hours between your last sin and your next confession. But if history teaches us anything, it's this: no amount of incense can smother human desire forever. Behind abbey walls and beneath monastic robes, real people lived, and not all of them were content to spend a lifetime meditating on divine love when the much messier kind was just a stone corridor away. Life behind the walls. More crowded, more complicated. Let's clear up the idea that monasteries were solitary places of quiet introspection. In reality, medieval religious institutions were busy, complex communities. A large abbey might house dozens or even hundreds of men or women. There were novices, lay brothers or sisters, visiting pilgrims, scribes, cooks, gardeners, and sometimes noble children sent to be educated. And not all residents took strict vows. Some were there temporarily. Others entered under family pressure, not personal conviction. A noble daughter whose family couldn't cost afford a dowry might be sent to a convent instead, less expensive than marriage and much more spiritually flattering. A second or third son with no inheritance might be nudged toward the priesthood, often reluctantly. These weren't saints. They were teenagers, young adults, middle-aged monks with bad knees and regrets, and elderly nuns who'd seen enough scandal to write 3 volumes of ecclesiastical gossip. Which is exactly why rules existed. Strict ones. Celibacy, chastity, and reality. The Church demanded chastity from all religious personnel: monks, nuns, priests, friars, and everyone in between. Celibacy wasn't just a spiritual aspiration, it was a sacred requirement. In theory, monks and nuns married Christ, devoting all affection, attention, and energy to divine service. Earthly desire was to be extinguished like candlelight at Vespers. But again, theory and practice often lived on opposite ends of the cloister. There are records, lots of them, documenting lapses, from secret affairs and pregnancies to full-blown romantic entanglements between monks and nuns in neighboring houses. In one infamous 14th century case in France, an abbess was found to be cohabiting with a priest. Not in secret, but quite openly, their relationship apparently known to the entire convent and several neighboring parishes. In another case, a German nun confessed under duress that she and 5 other sisters had engaged in sinful touching and had stolen sweets from the pantry, a surprisingly common form of illicit bonding in convents. Apparently, medieval rebellion often included both sex and sugar. Love in the cloister. Hidden notes and hollowed-out walls. How did they get away with it? Creatively. Letters were smuggled under bread loaves. Courtyards became rendezvous points. Secret passageways built for maintenance or safety were occasionally repurposed for far more personal visits. Some monasteries and convents were within walking distance of each other, and that led to opportunities. There are even stories, some apocryphal, some suspiciously well documented, of pregnant nuns, of hidden births, of monks climbing garden walls under cover of night, and of full-blown love stories that would make modern romance novelists blush. One tragic tale from Italy recounts a monk and a nun who fell deeply in love through whispered conversations during shared services. When their affair was discovered, the monk was defrocked and exiled, while the nun was sentenced to 20 years of penance in an underground cell. Their only contact afterward came through a crack in the wall, where they continued to pass messages and, reportedly, even kiss fingers through the stone. It's dramatic, it's heartbreaking, and it's 100% medieval. Church discipline, punishment, and public shame. The Church took violations of chastity very seriously, at least officially. Nuns caught in romantic entanglements might be publicly shamed, confined to a cell, placed on bread and water diets, or stripped of their positions. Monks might face excommunication, flogging, or relocation to a more remote monastery as penance. But enforcement varied wildly. Some abbots and bishops turned a blind eye. especially if the offenders were from powerful families. Others were zealous in their punishments, using offenders as examples to maintain control and moral order. Confession manuals, those ever-reliable sources of uncomfortable detail, include pages of guidance for confessors dealing with monks and nuns who had fallen into temptation. The questions were just as invasive as those asked of married couples, and often more humiliating, as they implied betrayal not just of another person, but of God Himself. And yet, despite all this, people persisted. Because even in the most controlled environments, human longing refused to die quietly. It whispered in gardens. It trembled in candlelight. It carved poems on chapel walls. Love in vows, when devotion wasn't a disguise. Not all stories ended in scandal. Some monks and nuns transcended carnal desire through affection, forming deep, emotional, even romantic bonds that stayed within the bounds of their vows. A monk might write devotional poetry inspired by admiration for a nun's voice or piety. A nun might describe another sister in language that bordered on the erotic, but framed it as spiritual devotion. Modern historians still debate how to interpret these writings. Were they coded expressions of queer desire? Were they intense but platonic relationships? Or were they something else entirely? A fusion of sacred and emotional love that defies modern categories. Whatever the answer, the fact remains. Even in the most unlikely places, love found a way. Love might have been rare, but betrayal, that was common enough to become ritualized. In a society where marriage was bound by contract, sex by law, and honor by reputation, stepping outside those boundaries didn't just risk heartbreak. It could lead to humiliation, exile, mutilation, or death. This was a world where private infidelity could become a public spectacle, where whispered gossip might bring ruin, and where shame wasn't just emotional. It was something you might have to carry on your actual face. Adultery. Not just a sin, but a legal disaster. Let's start with adultery, one of the most dangerous romantic missteps of the medieval world. The Church considered it a mortal sin. Civil courts considered it a crime. And husbands, particularly noble or wealthy ones, considered it a direct threat to their honor, their bloodline, and their property. Punishment varied depending on class and gender. If a woman committed adultery, it could mean public penance, imprisonment, or, in extreme cases, execution, especially if she was highborn and her infidelity threatened issues of inheritance. For men, the consequences were often lighter, though not non-existent. A husband might face fines or a forced reconciliation, but if a lower-class man seduced or slept with a noble's wife, the outcome could be brutal: castration, flogging, or a slow and inconvenient death. And yes, there were actual laws regulating this. In parts of medieval France, a husband who caught his wife in the act could legally kill both her and her lover on the spot, as long as it happened in flagrante delicto, that is, while the crime was being committed. Anything later was murder. Timing was everything. Public punishment, stocks, shaming, and symbolic scars. When adultery or fornication, sex outside marriage, was discovered, the punishment wasn't always private. Medieval societies were obsessed with public morality and public punishment. You might be paraded through the village in nothing but your underclothes, put in the pillory while neighbors threw dung and insults, forced to wear symbolic clothing, like donkey ears, horns, to mark you as a cuckold, or a heavy iron collar whipped in the market square, sometimes with signs hung around your neck detailing your sins. In some towns, adulterous couples were even tied together and dunked in the river, not to drown them, but to publicly cleanse them. The shame often lingered longer than the bruises. Infidelity among the nobility. Scandal in silk. When the elite committed adultery, the stakes were even higher, but the rules more flexible. A king could have mistresses as long as they were discreet. A queen, however, Not so much. Take Isabella of Angoulême, wife of King John of England, the same king who lost the crown jewels in a swamp and got forced into signing the Magna Carta. After John's death, Isabella allegedly had a long affair with her own son-in-law. Though the church grumbled, she lived out her life in relative peace, protected by her rank and powerful family. Contrast that with Joan of Burgundy, Queen of France, who was implicated in the notorious Tour de Nesle affair, a scandal in which several noblewomen were accused of carrying on secret affairs with knights. Some were imprisoned. Others were beaten. The king's sister-in-law was allegedly shaved bald, dressed in black, and forced to walk barefoot through the court. The lesson? Power could shield you, but only up to a point, especially if you were a woman. False accusations and weaponized honor. Sometimes accusations of infidelity were strategic. A nobleman might accuse his wife of adultery to get rid of her and marry someone more politically advantageous. A woman might accuse her lover of seduction in order to preserve her own reputation. In some legal systems, an accused adulteress had to undergo a trial by ordeal to prove her innocence. One common method? Walking barefoot across burning plowshares. If her feet healed cleanly, God had declared her pure. Needless to say, outcomes were often inconclusive. Reputation, especially for women, was as valuable as gold. A whisper of impropriety could ruin a girl's marriage prospects, affect her family's standing, or even end in forced confinement in a convent, whether or not she'd actually done anything wrong. In some regions, women carried written testimonials from priests or midwives certifying their virginity before marriage. A medieval version of receipts, love triangles, blood feuds, and murder. Most romantic betrayal didn't just destroy households, it could destroy entire villages. If a man seduced another man's wife or daughter, and the injured party belonged to a powerful family, it could start a blood feud. The offending lover might flee, only to be hunted down years later. In regions with weak central authority, this kind of personal vengeance filled the vacuum left by absent law enforcement. One 13th century German chronicle recounts a farmer who killed his wife's lover after catching them in the hayloft. The killer then dragged the body through town, tied to a cart, before confessing to the local bishop, who granted him absolution, citing righteous fury. The crowd, it said, applauded. In another tale, a knight returned from crusade to find his lady had taken a lover. He offered her a choice: drink poison or watch her lover die. She drank the poison. He still killed the lover anyway. Then he left for the Holy Land again, apparently feeling spiritually refreshed. When love was a crime, and the crime was loving the wrong person. Sometimes love itself was the crime, not because of infidelity, but because of class, race, religion, or gender. A Christian falling in love with a Jew or Muslim. Scandalous. In some places, illegal. In others, it is punishable by exile or death. A peasant trying to elope with a noblewoman. Grounds for arrest, and occasionally execution for kidnapping, even if she went willingly. The social order had to be preserved. And love, wild, unpredictable, disobedient love, was a threat to that order. And yet, it persisted. Love in the Middle Ages was not innocent. It was not safe. It was a gamble, with stakes as high as your land, your soul, and your life. In modern stories, love ends with the kiss. In medieval reality, it often ended in pregnancy, and that, more than anything else, shaped the lives and destinies of women. The moment love crossed into sex, the body became a battlefield. For women, especially, passion came with real, visible, and often deadly consequences. The dangerous miracle of birth. Pregnancy was not a gentle season. It was a crisis, a dangerous state that tested a woman's body and soul. The average medieval woman gave birth multiple times, often starting in her teens and continuing until menopause, or until death claimed her in labor, which was distressingly common. Maternal mortality was high. Not because medieval people were ignorant, but because medicine had limits, and infection, hemorrhage, or prolonged labor could quickly turn fatal. There were midwives, of course, experienced women who learned from mothers and grandmothers, passing knowledge through whispered advice and observation rather than formal schooling. They knew herbal remedies to ease pain or stimulate contractions. They whispered prayers to saints like Saint Margaret, patroness of childbirth, and made charms to protect mother and child. But there was only so much they could do. A baby in the wrong position could mean death for both mother and child. There were no C-sections, at least not ones that spared the mother. No anesthesia, no antiseptics. If a birth went badly, it was often followed by a hurried baptism for the dying infant and a shrouding for the mother. And yet women kept going through it, because they had little choice, and because bearing children was one of the few ways women could gain spiritual and social validation. Pregnancy, outside marriage, proof and punishment. A pregnancy outside marriage didn't just risk your health, it threatened your entire future. For unmarried women, pregnancy was proof. No need for witnesses, no need for testimony. A swelling belly was a confession no court could ignore. The church and the law both had little sympathy. A pregnant maid could be dismissed, disgraced, or even imprisoned. In extreme cases, especially if the father was unknown or the woman was accused of promiscuity, she could be executed for fornication or infanticide, even without proof of a crime. Some women fled to convents. Others hid their pregnancies as long as they could, hoping to survive in secret. A few left their babies at church doors, hoping a kind priest or pious woman would raise the child. And while we often hear about fallen women and their punishments, let's not forget the other side. The men often walked free. Even if they were known, they might face a mild fine, a brief penance, or a forced marriage, rarely more. Marriage, fertility, and the burden of proof. Within marriage, pregnancy was expected, and so was fertility. A wife's main duty, especially in noble or royal households, was to produce heirs. If she failed, she was blamed, regardless of whether the husband was the real issue. Women were sometimes sent away for treatment, while the husband kept trying with a new bride or mistress. If a woman became pregnant too soon after marriage, whispers followed. Was it truly her husband's child? Was there a secret lover? If too much time passed and no pregnancy came, she might be accused of witchcraft, sterility, or spiritual unworthiness. It was a lose-lose situation. Pregnancy too early? Suspicious. Too late? Disappointing. Too many sons? A blessing. Too many daughters? A burden. And in all this, no one asked the mother what she wanted. Her body wasn't hers. It was the family's, the husband's, the church's, or the court's. Childbirth as a spiritual trial. For all its physical danger, childbirth was also viewed as a test of faith. Women were encouraged to pray during labor, to offer their pain as a form of penitence. If they survived, they often underwent a ceremony called churching, a ritual purification that allowed them to re-enter sacred spaces. It wasn't just religious, it was social. Until a woman was churched, she might be considered ritually unclean and excluded from public life. The process was symbolic. A woman, after enduring months of vulnerability and hours of agony, had to be re-blessed just to be seen as whole again. But this also gave women a unique moment of communal power. Female relatives and neighbors often gathered during labor, forming a sacred circle of support. No men were allowed in the birthing chamber. It was one of the rare places where only women held authority. Motherhood, love, and loss. Not all babies survived. In fact, infant mortality was terrifyingly common. 1 in 3 children died before age 5. And yet, medieval mothers loved fiercely. Some cradled their babies with prayers and lullabies. Others commissioned tiny baby shoes or embroidered swaddling cloths. Poor mothers clutched their newborns in straw beds. Wealthy mothers sang to them under tapestries and warmed their fingers near hearths. And when a baby died, which many did, the grief was real, recorded in letters, diaries, and court records. Medieval people were not emotionally numb. They wept, mourned, buried their children with tiny tokens, and tried again, because that was the only option. The female body in medieval thought, a site of mystery and control. At the root of it all was how people thought about the female body. Medieval medicine, built on ancient Greek texts, believed that women were colder, wetter, and more changeable than men. Their wombs were thought to wander inside them. Their emotions were unstable. Their blood, especially menstrual blood, was seen as mysterious, dangerous, even toxic. So women's bodies were treated with suspicion. They needed to be controlled, observed, directed by fathers, priests, husbands, and physicians. But they were also venerated. The Virgin Mary, the ultimate mother, was a spiritual icon. Pregnancy was tied to divine miracles. The womb was both sacred and terrifying, a vessel of life and sometimes a portal of death. It was a paradox. The very thing that made women valuable also made them vulnerable. The Middle Ages weren't as straight as they'd like you to believe. Though the official doctrine of Church and Crown condemned sodomy, unnatural affection, and anything beyond the reproductive norm, queer love still existed. In poetry, in politics, in private correspondence, and sometimes in the open. It was criminalized, yes, sometimes violently. But it was also expressed, lived, and in some cases even celebrated if you knew how to look. Men loving men. Brotherhood, passion, and punishment. Medieval Europe saw intense bonds between men, especially among knights, clerics, and scholars. These friendships, known as amicitia, or brotherly love, were openly affectionate and even romantic in tone. Men wrote each other letters full of longing, loyalty, and devotion. But where did affection end and desire begin? Some of these relationships were likely platonic. Others, scholars believe, crossed into physical love. The lines were blurry, deliberately so. Homosocial affection was culturally acceptable, even encouraged, as long as it wasn't too obviously sexual. But when it was sexual, that's where trouble began. In the later Middle Ages, especially post-13th century, sodomy laws became more aggressive. The word sodomy itself was vague. It could refer to any non-procreative act, not just male-male sex. But when male lovers were caught or accused, punishment was swift and brutal. In Florence in the 1300s, entire youth cliques were surveilled and punished for suspected same-sex relations. In London, records from the early 1300s describe men burned at the stake for the abominable vice. Yet, despite persecution, underground subcultures of queer men persisted, especially in cities and courts. Some found a measure of safety by entering monasteries, where intimacy could be cloaked in vows of brotherhood. Others found danger there. Letters and penitentials from monks sometimes reveal confessions of desire, shame, and repeated struggle. But not all was fear and secrecy. Some love was tender, passionate, defiant. In 13th century France, a poem titled Les Amis describes one knight S burning love for another, calling him more beautiful than the morning sun. It circulated in courtly circles disguised as chivalric praise. Women loving women, cloisters, poems, and quiet defiance. Relationships between women were both less policed and less recorded, partly because society didn't much believe women capable of real heady passion without men involved. That blind spot allowed queer women to exist in the gaps of the record, in convents, among noble ladies, and in the poetry of longing written in the margins. In nunneries, where women lived together in intense emotional and spiritual intimacy, many formed particular friendships. deep bonds that were often romantic and sometimes sexual. Letters between nuns like Sister Benedetta Carlini, a 17th century example with medieval echoes, and their companions suggest relationships that went far beyond sisterly affection. Some convents even issued rules banning two nuns from sharing a cell, because the temptation was well known. Outside the cloister, wealthy women who chose not to marry often lived with other unmarried women in what scholars sometimes call Boston marriages. They shared beds, homes, finances, and in many cases, affection that looks deeply like queer partnership, even if they left no love letters behind. Poetry also carried their voices. In 12th century Germany, the Minnesänger wrote songs of courtly love, and a few wrote them from women's perspectives about loving other women. One such verse praises a beautiful maiden, whose lips and hair haunt the speaker who odious dreams. Was it metaphor? Was it code? Or was it real love, disguised just enough to survive? Transgression and fluidity. Beyond binary boundaries. The Middle Ages could understand gender and sexuality in modern terms, but that doesn't mean they didn't notice when someone didn't fit the mold. Records exist of cross-dressing saints, female monks, and men who lived as women, sometimes as spiritual devotion, other times as survival or identity. These stories were recorded with fascination, sometimes admiration, sometimes horror. Saint Marinos, or Marina, disguised herself as a man to join a monastery, lived undetected for years, and was only discovered at death. In 14th century London, John Eleanor Reichner, a trans sex worker, was arrested for wearing women's clothing and sleeping with both men and women. Their court record, oddly detailed, reveals astonishing fluidity and resilience. These individuals existed outside official sanction, but they also reveal that the boundaries of gender and sexuality were negotiated, not fixed. Even church penitentials, those moral guidebooks for confessors, list scenarios involving women who lie with women, men who wear women's clothing, and unnatural affections. The church acknowledged what society claimed not to see: risk, reward, and the quiet resistance of love. To love outside the norm in the Middle Ages was to risk excommunication, imprisonment, execution, or worse, erasure from history. And yet, people did it anyway. They wrote poems, they built lives, they loved in secret, and they carved out spaces within a world that didn't always make room for them. Some were punished, some were forgotten, but some were remembered, not as deviants, but as devoted lovers, their stories whispered in letters, sung in songs, and preserved in the margins of manuscripts. Queer love in the Middle Ages wasn't just about danger, it was about courage. Well, friends, we've reached the end of our candlelit detour through the boudoirs, barns, brothels, and ballads of medieval Europe. And, if nothing else, we've proven one thing beyond all scholarly doubt. The Middle Ages were not as prudish, predictable, or puritanical as your high school history textbook led you to believe. Behind every statue of a saint, behind every Latin Mass and woolen tunic, there were real people, with real desires, real awkwardness, and very little privacy. We saw that romance in the medieval world wasn't just about passion. It was about timing, diplomacy, church calendars, dowries, and, occasionally, avoiding a chicken in the corner giving you judgy side-eye. We learned that the church had an opinion about everything, from what days you could enjoy your spouse to what direction you were allowed to face while doing so. Hint: not toward Jerusalem, and definitely not enthusiastically. We uncovered how even the most devout monasteries had their quiet scandals, how noblewomen navigated lives of surveillance and strategy, and how peasants, practical and persistent, made time for love between tending the turnips and dodging the plague. We talked about forbidden love, secret trysts, coded letters, and love potions made with questionable herbs. We walked through the hushed corridors of convents and the raucous alleyways of city brothels. We discovered that chastity belts were a myth, that moon phases might determine your bedroom schedule, and that some medieval bishops were really nosy. And most importantly, we saw that love, in all its forms, has always found a way, even when it had to sneak through the barley fields at night disguised in poetry or prayer. The medieval world was messy, passionate, and deeply human. Love wasn't always romantic. It wasn't always fair. It wasn't always safe. But it was always there, behind the church doors, beneath the straw mattresses, inside the letters, and between the lines. Before you go, if you've enjoyed this strange and scandalous stroll through history, don't forget to give the video a like. It is the digital equivalent of buying me a pint at a medieval tavern minus the questionable hygiene and rats. Subscribe if you haven't already, not out of obligation, but because you're the kind of person who reads footnotes, laughs at obscure jokes, and sticks around for the long stories. That's my kind of crowd. Let me know in the comments. What surprised you the most? Would you survive a medieval relationship? Do you think St. Valentine would approve of your current dating choices? And if you've got a favorite part of medieval love lore I missed, drop it below. I read every comment, usually with a cup of tea and an expression of delighted horror. Coming soon. If you're hungry for more, we'll dive into medieval beauty standards, why pale skin, high foreheads, and weird hairlines were the medieval version of a thirst trap. Or maybe you're curious about medieval curses, wedding rituals, or what people wore under those 14 layers of wool. Spoiler, not much. Either way, more historical mischief is on the way. So dim the lights, say a small prayer for forbidden love, and as always, stay curious, stay strange, and never trust a monk with a locked garden. Good night, and may your dreams be slightly more comfortable than a shared straw mattress in 14th century Flanders.